we're talking about these five elements. And before beginning, I thought I'd remind you of this poem that's on the website. This is actually by our own Yasha Smilak, which also very nicely in a tanka summarizes the elements of five images and also incorporates Mac King in a very clever sort of way. If you look at this, you can see that the beginnings of these become coins and then vanish. So I want to, yesterday I had you all engraving April 10th in your minds. I won't do that today, but I do want to do another exercise. I'd like you to follow the instructions. So raise, as soon as you see this, raise your right hand, okay? Please follow instructions, okay? Lower your right hand. Nod your head twice. Clap your hands 3 times. Excellent, you're a wonderful group. Now, pay attention. Think about what you did when you just paid attention and the difference between clapping your hands and paying attention. Now I want you to try something else, even more challenging task, but I know you're up to it. Pay attention to your kidneys. What do you do when you are asked to pay attention to your kidneys? Well, I'm not sure what you did, but what I would do, my impulse when I see pay attention is I tend to sit up a little straighter. There's a muscular reaction. And there's also a visual reaction. I tend to focus. Even though I'm not sure what to focus on, you say pay attention. When I'm told to pay attention to my kidneys, again, there's somewhat of a visual impulse. I try to imagine my kidneys. And I think this act of visualization is an important part of seeing that we didn't really discuss. So Peter Vogt very nicely, actually very appropriately for this, my comments, described this relationship of the I and the thing. But to talk first about the Daoist meditation chart and this traditional meditation called what's sometimes termed as meditative visualization. And that's the basis of this chart known as the Neijing tool. This chart itself is a 19th century version, but the practice goes back well over 1,000 years earlier. The idea is that the inside of the body is full of organs. So if one of the crucial aspects of the Western body was the skeleton, the crucial aspect of the Chinese body was the presence of organs. And the organs were not just sort of viscerally looked at from the outside, but were residences of divinities, of spirits, of life. And these organs had different kinds of divinities. And ensuring the presence of those divinities was ensuring your life. So in this sense, Mark Elliott and I had this discussion last night at dinner about whether, how to translate this notion of the word distraction in Chinese. It's not entirely obvious. But practices like this, on the other hand, underline really the fundamental importance of the ability to attend in self-cultivation. So the premise of this is that there are these divinities, that is life that's inside you, and one easily can become distracted. So the practice of Sun Tzu, or this kind of meditation, is you imagine the different parts of your body, you imagine these crucial organs, and you visualize the presence of these divinities within each of these organs. As long as you can make these divinities present, then you'll be fine. So the idea is, okay, you imagine this divinity here, you imagine these divinity here, because there are always these things that are distracting you, that are pulling you out, pulling these divinities out of you. And the danger is that as you get distracted, these divinities will depart from you and leave you depleted. So this is probably the single most fundamental paradigm of Chinese medicine, that there's a life force that's within you, and as you get distracted, various things pull this life force out, so that this distraction leads to kind of loss of self, this self-absence. And in this sense, it's related to the self-control site that we talked about yesterday. And what happens when you become depleted is then you have all these spirits that invade you, right? These evil spirits invade you because you've lost yourself. But what does it mean to actually see? So one form of seeing is not simply the seeing of something outside, but visualizing something inside. This clearly is visualizing things on the outside, but what does it really tell us about sight? Well, of course, there are many kinds of interpretations, but probably the most outstanding feature of this illustration is precisely the superabundance of things to see. So you have, this parakeet from some land. You have abundance of paintings. You have, not least, the shells that we discussed yesterday. We have the central figure of Juno, who's contemplative. She's looking at a portrait of Christ healing the blind. So it's a picture about sight, but very suggestively evoking this famous biblical tale of Christ healing someone who couldn't see. And then in the background, these people who are somehow peering, one peering at us, one somehow peering at Juno. And then we have a dog who's looking at Christ. So David had cats, we have dogs here. The dog's gaze. But in any case, one could go on for hours and hours, days maybe, studying this. And this is probably the central point of this picture, that even if you just take one small portion of this, you can see the enormous intricacy and precision of detail. So that ultimately one's left with a sense of the impossibility of seeing, that one could never exhaust everything there is to see. And so this takes us back to our discussion yesterday about the gap between the infinite world of things to see, things that one would want to see, things that attract attention, and the limited nature of our lives. And this brings me to curiosity. And in the history of science, probably the most influential of definition of curiosity is that of Augustine, who defined curiosity as the lust of the eyes, an ocular concupiscence. For a long time, curiosity was a vice. And this notion of concupiscence, this notion of lust, persists in this 18th century usage, whereby if you look at book catalogs of the 18th century, you often find this category of curious books, which means erotica. So there is this very close connection between curiosity and the erotic, which of course gives us one immediate connection to the shunga of Uramaro. But of course, there are all kinds of erotica, and there's all kinds of looking. So we see this gentleman, his face, and maybe divine from his gaze that he's contemplating the next move in a Go game. We see a woman. I don't know exactly what you think she's seeing or what she's thinking. We have all sorts of thoughts. She certainly doesn't seem very excited, maybe bored, as Jay was talking about yesterday. And yet, if we look at the entire picture, we see this is also an erotic print. It's a very different kind of erotic print. It's not the kind of erotic print that stimulates intense desire. And this is one of the characteristics of the Chinese erotic prints, that if you compare them to the Japanese prints, there's this casualness, this open, first of all, the open air, this relaxed, as people say in French, détendu, this relaxed air of casual enjoyment. So that if you were just to look at the faces, you might not even suspect that this is, in fact, an erotic print. Whereas it's pretty clear from the Japanese prints what's going on. And, so I mean, you can sort of imagine what our Chinese heroine of just a moment ago might sort of think in looking upon this scene. This is an erotic print, but I've never actually seen anything like this in either Chinese or European prints. But this is very common in Japanese prints. That is inscriptions. And these inscriptions are not identifying who these characters are. It doesn't say who these are, male or female or anything like this. It just says, well, I'll just read you part of it. It says, "Mo, so you do." And I don't think I need to translate for you. So there's a strong auditory component to these images. And there's also a lot of body language. And this is actually the central point that I want to bring up today. So here's the illustration that David Howell was just describing, this man watching a meteor. And of course, we don't see the meteor. What we see really, I mean, we sort of see the traces of the falling star, but we especially see the man looking at the falling star. This is the centerpiece of the picture, is a person, we're looking at someone looking at something. And this actually is one of the recurring characteristics of this work. In fact, what I want to suggest is many other works, is that what we find in many of these Edo works on that deal with various aspects of what we might consider natural history give quite a bit of attention to, not to the objects themselves, but to people looking at objects. So these rocks in isolation, I mean, they have shiny sort of lines indicating that they're shiny, but they don't seem particularly interesting per se. It's what makes them interesting is the way the people are looking at these stones. Another illustration from Unkonshi. And this, I think, is one of the most interesting and important characteristics that we find in not all the illustrations by any means, but it's a significant number. So that if we were just to, if Kinouchi Secretary were just to show us these formations in the cavern, they're sort of interesting, but it's especially the presence of people looking at them that gives them the particular, that incites our curiosity and interest. Kishite Ginko in the 19th century, who's sort of playing continuing this tradition, gives us a stele with, this is an advertisement for his patent medicines, but listing the various capacities of his drugs, but then he has people reading this ad. And it's particularly because people are reading this ad, because we see people who are curious about something, that we ourselves become more curious. So the basic point I want to make is that a traditional conception of epistemology revolves around the dichotomy of the observer and the observed, or the self and the object, right? The self and things. And if you go from, let's say, from Kant to postmodernism, so much of the philosophical discourse is devoted to trying to figure out the complexities and nuances and get around the difficulties of the observer trying to get at the thing itself. What the Japanese illustrations suggest is, and this I think is the model that underlies these kinds of illustrations like sight, where you're given a plethora of objects and with always the suggestion of vanity, always the suggestion of temporality, always a sense that there's too much to see, there's too little time, but it's really this relationship between the observer and the object. Whereas the Japanese illustration suggests that it may be worth thinking about an alternative scheme as well. So yes, there is the observer and the observed object, but that isn't all. And that it may be worth thinking about what happens when we think about observers looking at other observers looking at objects. There's obviously an overlap between this, to some extent, and ideas, let's say, of social framing, the importance of social beliefs, but I think it's a little bit different. This is from another famous work of the 19th century, a work on the northern countries, and this is a picture of fossils. This is a camel fossil and a crab fossil on the bottom right. But in this work, he not only has, the author not only has illustrations of these fossils, but on the next page, he shows people looking at these fossils. And it's especially this looking, this contemplation of the object, that makes them seem so much more interesting. One strategy to make objects look interesting is to try to describe them in very intricate details, to make them as realistic, that is, as thing-like as possible. But here we have another strategy, which is to depict the attitude of other people looking at this object and to sort of shape our perception of the object by filtering it through the reactions of others. And this brings me to Mac King's magic trick. So it's a wonderful trick. You know, he's so effortless, like all great magicians. Just look at it again. So how does he manage to trick us? Well, of course, rationally, right? You know that it can't just disappear. You know probably he somehow figured out, he's palmed it. He's keeping it in the hand. He hasn't actually thrown it, right? But how does he persuade us that it's actually moved, right? Well, there are lots of things he does, and we know this. But if you look at this aspect of it, it's pretty convincing. But let's break it down. So here's the early coin toss, still playing with it. And of course, he's looking. His gaze is an important part of it, right? He's looking at his hand, and we're following his gaze. In fact, we're being manipulated by his gaze. Looks at, and then of course, the great part is then he himself looked totally bewildered at what happened to it, right? And we share his bewilderment. That's part of what makes the magic trick work. So, the three stages look something like this. And we're used to this. Basically, the magician misdirects our gaze, makes us pay attention to something that we're not supposed to pay attention to. But what I'd like you to notice is that he's not only directing, he doesn't actually keep our eyes focused on his hand. Midway through, this is so, in the bottom frame on the right, he hasn't quite finished the trick, right? He's still holding the hand closed. What he's doing is he's looking at us. Right? It's something that you can easily miss because it's such a short video, right? But he's not directing our gaze to his hand. He's looking up at us, right? And forcing us to look at him.
As long as I'm keeping eye contact with you, it allows me to raise your suspicion level.
This is Paulo Robbins'
Same thing if I go here and I keep eye contact with you all the way. It's rather suspicious and you keep very focused on me. But if I want to get underneath that, I can break eye contact as I go into the space and share a common view with you, like a confluence of looking at something. And now I'm very close inside your space. Now if I don't want you to focus on this anymore, I can just look at you, and that draws your attention up into this triangle. And you're less interested in what's happening here, but allows me to do things here while your focus is here. You've got this spotlight that just moves back and forth.
That there is a very powerful effect of not only the direction of the gaze, but the effect of somebody looking at you that forces you to look at that face and pay attention to the face. And of course, we know from physiology that an important part of brain recognition is devoted specifically to the recognition of faces and facial expressions. And so that the manipulation of the face, attention to the face, is really a critical part of our perceptual mechanisms. And what I want to suggest is that this attention to faces, attention to others, was really a critical part of the curiosity of the period. So this is an exhibition of medicinal goods from the early 19th century. You have all sorts of not just actually medicines, but even though, various curiosities, objects of curiosity assembled. But if you look at this picture, you can see that there's just as much attention, perhaps even more attention, paid to the people who have actually come to see the exhibits than to the exhibits themselves. And this is a very common phenomenon. So this is a guidebook to Kyoto showing the Gion area. And what makes this place a place is really the people who are, lugging around. And in much the same way that Bruegel's site was full of objects, this is full of people, but also people with very clearly recognizable facial expressions. And there's just this hub of wealth of activity that makes you think it would be pretty fun to go there. So this is a tobacco vendor selling the newest pipe vendor. And this is just one page in this booklet where you have all sorts of faces, all sorts of people, and also drawn very simply. Famous places of Edo, one of the famous temples in Edo. And again, what makes this a place worth visiting is not necessarily any of the structures, but really the diversity of people. And this is the attraction. What's also interesting is that these faces are really, really simple. I mean, if we try to imitate it, we could imitate it. On this point, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, wonderful book if you don't know it, I think provides some very interesting, suggestive insights. So Scott McCloud talks about the range of comic depictions and how you can see faces in comics that are sometimes almost photorealistic to those who are like these pictures on the right, which are very close to what we see in many of the Edo prints. And he suggests that our reactions to different depictions of faces are in fact quite different, so that the more realistic the picture is, the more you see it as somebody's face, somebody else. But the more simplistic the face is, we tend to identify with the face. And this is what makes this cartoons such an attractive medium, this process of identification, this sense of participation. And I suggest that one of the things that you find in many of these Edo works is this emphasis on trying to get the reader not to look just simply at objects, but actually to think about participation. So this is another illustration from this work on the northern countries, the snow countries of the north. And again, you just have depictions of some of the snow gear used by the farmers. But then you have them, in the next page, you have scenes of these people using these implements. And here, it's not so much, once you start seeing people in them, your attention shifts from the snow gear itself to the expressions of the people, the sense of a lived life. This work on agricultural implements from 1822 shows you a pair of the kind of sandals that farmers might use. But then the accompanying illustration, the sandals play a very small part. And in fact, we become much more interested in the kind of conversation that these people are having. My last illustration, this is from a work on pest extermination. Now, it might look like from these bubbles that these are conversations that people are having, but in fact, they're just descriptions of various forms of various activities involved in the use of whale oil for preventing the rise of insect larvae in the fields. This is not the activity so much as really the sense of these people as seemingly sort of having a good time. And this is from the same illustration. And so, although these are technical manuals teaching you about agricultural techniques, in fact, the text is quite detailed, they seem almost like bucolic scenes. So that my suggestion is that one of the things that's interesting, one sort of contrast that's interesting to think about is if the illustrations like sight and some of the illustrations we talked about yesterday, so evoke this sense of vanitas, of transience. One of the characteristics of many of these illustrations in the Edo period is evoking a sense of nostalgia. So it's a different sense of time. I'd like to conclude with that and move on to discussion.